Welcome to the 4th edition of Agenda Africa, organized by Iberian Lawyer and with the special support from Cuatro Casas Gonçalves Pereira, Miranda and Vieira Almeida. This forum focuses on Lusophone Africa and legal services in Mozambique and Angola.
Our first speaker is, to my left, Elisabete, who is going to give us a background introduction on the current economic situation in Africa.
10 years ago, the magazine Economist published a special issue on Africa, and the title was Africa, the Hopeless Continent. 10 years after 2013, last year, the image changed drastically, and the same magazine issue one number just devoted to Africa, and the title was Emerging Africa, a Hopeful Continent. And this change also actually happened because of economic growth. The last 10 years, among the 10 most fastest economic growth in the world, 6 are in Africa. And within these 6, 2 are Portuguese-speaking countries, that is Angola and Mozambique. The other ones are Angola, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Chad, Mozambique, and Rwanda. So these 6 countries belonging to the 10 most fastest growing economies made the world look at Africa differently. Politically, this change has started a little bit earlier. The last 20 years, Africa witnessed a complete political wave of democratization. The democratization that arrived in Africa made a difference for economic growth and for the legal and business environment in the region. So we are talking of a very different Africa today. Mozambique has been a very consistent country having elections. Since 1994, there was all in the constitutionally respect for the elections, 94, 99, 2004, 2009, and they will have elections again in the end of this year. In the multi-party system, there are party dominance, clear party dominance from the ruling party, has more than 75% of the seats in the parliament, and the majority of the municipalities are still from Frelimo, the ruling party. The system is highly presidential, means that the president can appoint and resign where else, even the vice-chancellor of public universities. We need to be very careful about the following months, what's going to happen in terms of the stability of this region.
The next speaker is a tag team here that is going to provide us with an insight as to the legal services provision and client expectations in Africa. Lisa established Acritas 10 years ago, and Stephen Blundell works with some of the world's leading professional firms, so we have a very experienced team here to give us their insight on the growth of the market. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. You may remember that last year I talked a little bit about some research. I thought in order to keep that momentum going, it would be good to bring a friend of mine along, Lisa Hart-Shepherd, who runs Acritas, and they do enormous amounts of research around the world in terms of how law firms are grappling with both established and developing marketplaces.
Good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is the results of our global survey of multinationals. We interviewed general counsel at some of the largest multinationals around the world. Just so you know, there was 625 of those general counsel that we asked the question, spread all across the world. 27% had needs in Africa. When we looked at the largest companies, so the billion-dollar-plus revenue company, that went to 30%. So we're looking at nearly 1 in 3 having needs in the Africa continent. When we look at their spend, which is important for the law firms who are considering that region, the spend wasn't particularly high in sort of mature market terms of legal spend. They were spending around $100,000. But there were some very high spenders who were spending many millions on legal advice across the Africa region. So that took the mean average to 3.8 million. And where is the interest coming from? Well, it was actually spread across the world, just because of the sheer size of Europe and the number of organizations that are headquartered in Europe and North America. That was the 2 main regions that had needs.
Let me just make an interesting observation here. The American firms come out top there. But if you were to go and talk in Africa and say how well networked, how well known are the US firms there, the models, as I mentioned last year, are profoundly different. At the moment, for the most part, the Americans are flying in and flying out and doing the work. And it's the English law firms, for the most part, that are really developing those bilateral relationships, and they are far, far better known so far. But it's not lost on me, and probably not lost on anyone in the room, that if we look around the delegates today, I did a little count, and there's almost equal numbers of what I would regard as US firms and English law firms here.
Sticking with the same theme of where the interest in Africa is coming from, now looking at the industries that the respondents were based in, those that had needs in Africa. Manufacturing came up top. Straight after that was energy and natural resources, the financial institutions having interest there, the tech, media, telecoms, real estate, construction, transport, logistics, and then pharma, healthcare. So a good range of industries there having needs in the region.
And the other thing to say, of course, is those of you who watch the economic indicators, if we look at those figures over the coming years, there's no question that the ones that are consumer-driven will start to climb a great deal. So, consumer spending, as we all know, is really on the increase, and some of those things that are driven by that in the countries concerned will change markedly really quickly, I think.
We asked them which firms they're currently using for their high-value work in the Africa region. Now, we had, interestingly, the predominant choice was an international firm rather than a local firm. So they're definitely going for a firm that they know, despite the fact that many of the firms that they mentioned didn't have any footprint in the region at all. And that's because of the comfort of dealing with an international firm that knows them as an organisation, and they can also have some expectation of the service standards and expertise that they might get.
The surprise to me was the proportion that is actually local, because I think a lot of people would expect that high-value work mostly to go to international firms. My instinct is that proportion that's local firm is growing quite fast, and I think if you want to look at the reasons why a lot of the international firms are so keen to put boots on the ground, it's because that proportion is growing. So the drive, I think, over the next few years will be that need to develop something which looks to be a more consistent level of service for the really big buyers, coupled with the respect for and ability to work with the firms who are there and very proud of their culture, their traditions and their ways of doing things.
The views and lessons learned from a general counsel at a public company, what they look at when doing business in emerging markets. And to provide that, we have Robin Story.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm just going to look at things from the perspective of a general counsel for a small mid-cap oil and gas company. Most of my experience is actually emerging markets. So just a couple of observations on the long-term perspectives for Africa. The BP Energy Outlook to 2035 was published quite recently. It notes that Africa will be a larger LNG exporter than the Middle East by 2035. And of the increase in projected growth of oil and gas demand, 95% of that increase is from non-OECD countries. Moving on to what keeps us awake at night as General Counsel of emerging markets companies in the oil and gas sector. The usual list of things, I think, apply to Lusophone Africa, just as they would do elsewhere around the world. So, firstly, a governing law, a petroleum law. We've seen elsewhere other legislation, subsidiary legislation, to plumb in those basic petroleum law rights. Secondly, a stable tax regime, royalty regime. I think I could be quite critical of the UK for the North Sea tax take. It's gone up and down. You see large differences over the years in attractiveness of North Sea investment. Obviously, clarity of the form of contract that's sort of put forward in Mozambique, I think, is a good way forward, so everyone knows where they are. Clarity on state participation, state interest. Very important that companies know what those sort of back-in rights are. I'd also make a general comment, very important, the conduct and reputation of a state company in any given country. Then we look at things like arbitration. Do we have a right to international arbitration? Petroleum law mentions ICSID rights, very important subsidiary or parallel right. Treaties in place with the UK, with the US, with the Netherlands, which has a very useful treaty protection to back things up. I think it's important to state just how important the right to arbitrate is, the ability to have that neutral forum. A governing law can be local, but you do need that forum to give sensible analysis. Stabilisation clauses to make sure that the rights are clear and are followed. Export rights. Is there a free right to export, or will there be large domestic market obligations? Local content clarity. Sometimes it is essential to have Western service company involvement. You need the ability to bring in those international players for the complicated work, especially for the offshore, the complicated points that Mozambique will be addressing. Environmental permitting. Is it a regime that encourages good operational practice, or is it a regime simply to tax the oil company? State consents for disposing of assets, preemptive right. These can either be clear, or sometimes you can see them these rights are changed. I've seen rights changed, originally intended to cover asset transfers, sales of company shares, companies involved in international takeovers. So are those preemptive rights and those state, and are they going to be amended just to suit particular company or project-specific considerations?
Rui is partner at Acritas and is going to give us the view from the outside and the inside, the legal market in Lusophone Africa, and some hints on building a practice there.
Thank you, Ben. What is called Lusophone Africa doesn't exist. It is a number of countries that speak the same language, but that's where it ends. Africa itself is a mosaic. We're going to see over the next few months very important changes in both Angola and Mozambique, politically, socially. It's a generational change that is going to come to powerful positions, and we don't know what's the outlook those people are going to bring to the table. So this is an area of uncertainty that you've got to be prepared for. We like to think about political stability. We hope that it will remain stable. The countries, those two countries, are changing dramatically from an economic point of view also because of peace context, and we hope that this will remain over the generational change, that it will be possible to maintain the conditions that have prevailed over the past 10, 12 years that have allowed for huge economic growth and a generation of huge differences from what it was. Very important is to understand these countries have high expectations in regard of what is going to happen to their own people. So this translates into requirements and expectations of use of local content, local people, local culture, local structures, local entities. Beware of the pressure that is going to be put forward by universities, by bar associations, local pressure groups in favor of their own people. And I think that that's to be expected. The clients, both corporations and private individuals, both foreign and local, are more sophisticated, more demanding, more attuned to cost, the value of the fees, and to the value of the work that is being put forward to them. So it's not necessarily easy to build up a practice. It's high risk, high reward if you play your cards well, if you look at the market, and if you are humble enough to understand that you've got to play by the local rules.